let's go to that Vox Pop and hear what the people have to say.
Horrific acts of atrocities, murders, regimes dedicated to killing us, tyranny and terror, slaughtered thousands.
How do you define terrorism?
Anything that causes harm or fear in normal people.
Trying to stop our freedom of life and disrupt it at all costs.
People being deprived of their rights of freedom.
Define terrorism, mad bastards.
To harm an individual or a group of people because of their religion or their race or just because of their differences.
But you're wearing the robes of traditional terrorists, of traditional haters.
6/11, Mumbai attacks, Beslan school hostage crisis. For 3 full days, a group of armed Islamic separatist militants, Russian cities of Buynetsky, Moscow, and Volgodonsk witnessed a series of blasts strike 4 apartment blocks. The Federal Building was a target for death and destruction, according to terrorist Timothy McVeigh.
I reckon state terrorism is the worst. For me, for a good example of that is Israel. Israel, who attack and do things that I would consider terrorist acts against Palestinians.
Tony Abbott, and all he's a terrorist. He's wrecking Australia. Oh, terrorists! Let's be scared of ISIS when it's just we'll show you ISIS here, but let's just pass some bills that are screwing over Australians.
To be quite honest, I think any terrorism is pretty dangerous. Anything, because everything's a snowball effect. It can all start from just the one single person, and eventually that just grows over time.
They may be banned as a terrorist organisation in the West, but here in their heartland of northern Sri Lanka, they are freedom fighters.
We are fighting against state terrorism, the Sri Lankan army. The international community should understand the difference between a freedom struggle and terrorism. We are not terrorists, we are freedom fighters.
Half the time, these terrorists, they're not open to negotiation because they have completely different beliefs.
You're always going to have the terrorists doing dirty deeds, and so you've got to get the army to go in and stop that stuff, as well as the politicians going and do their thing. It's 2 separate battles on the same field.
Some people you can't negotiate with.
Well, there's always going to be terrorism. There's always going to be new people who get upset.
If we want to stop terrorism, maybe Western countries should stop invading Middle East and other countries. For example, during the World War II in France, where I come from, there was resistance, which was at the time considered as terrorism.
You'll never beat it. Because that's the world.
Well, we've just heard what the people actually have to say. We've got someone calling into the studio. Adam Howard, what do you have to say?
Yeah, thanks very much, Gerry. Really interesting show this evening. Look, my area of expertise tends to be finance and economics. What I'd say is over the last couple of years, you've seen books released by Thomas Piketty and Joseph Stiglitz on the ridiculous levels of wealth inequality in today's society. And I've got to say that appears to be one of the primary drivers behind the increased levels of violence and terrorism that we're seeing today.
Are you saying that wars are being crafted because the accumulation of resources, that prospect of accumulating resources, the petrochemical dollar, is that what you're talking about?
Look, I think that the wealth that's been accumulated as a result of petrodollars has seen the levels of inequality, wealth-based inequality, absolutely skyrocket. And that's driven a lot of the smaller militant groups and their desire to hit back, if you like, at wealthy Western nations.
Well, will it be any different if these groups are in power?
No, I really don't think so. I mean, unfortunately...
So you're saying that they'll also want to accumulate resources and have a monopoly of power, so there's no hope?
Well, I do tend to think that it's kind of human hardwiring that we tend to want to binge when we're faced with the opportunity of oversupply. It's the basic feast or famine mechanism from when we were cavemen.
What I'm suggesting, Adam, aren't some worse than others? For instance, Alex Whisson was actually talking earlier effectively, and so was Noam Chomsky, of the United States of America as a supranational imperialist power. Aren't some working almost, no, in fact, extrajudicially and not listening to international law and sovereign laws?
Yeah, look, I definitely think that's a possibility, and having read a bit of Chomsky's stuff, I agree. You know, you see the biggest single industry within the United States is its military, and that subsidises a lot of other industries and has created the economy of the United States as we know it today. But at the same time, I don't know whether, you know, terrorism is something they've set out to use as a tool to control the masses. If you ask the people in power in the US, they'd probably reply that they're simply protecting the interests of their citizens.
Hasn't that always been a human narrative? In 1933, the Nazi government, the Hitler government, actually burnt down the Reichstag, the German parliament, and then blamed it on the communists.
Yeah.
And then enacted and enabled terrorism bills, anti-terrorism bills and homeland security, much the same of what we've actually had enabled and enacted today. So hasn't that been a narrative? And is this what is being played out?
Look, it is an ongoing narrative, I agree, and I don't really see that there's any way that we can stop that as part of the human condition. I do have a lot of positivity around the explosion of the availability of reliable content and information that the internet provides, and the way that it's possible to use that medium for people to pass on messages. You know, a lot of the Arab Spring that we saw stemmed from networks that exploded on social media. So that fills me with some positivity about the future.
Who owns the internet?
Well, that's right. Google, Facebook, I'm not sure.
Okay, no. Anyway, it's the military-industrial complex that put the internet together. If it gets too dangerous and too offensive, we don't know where this may go.
It is, but at the same time, you know, a lot of the technology that the military picked up, they picked up via universities. For instance, MIT, you know, Nicholas Negroponte's Media Lab at MIT is responsible for some of the most groundbreaking technology that we use on a day-to-day basis. And they came up with that of their own volition. It just happened to then be picked up and funded by the US military after the fact.
Okay.
So it's chicken and the egg. What came first?
Adam, thank you for your time. Happy to have you on and happy to have you on again. We'll go to our studio guests.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam. We'll go to our studio guests, Anne and Alex. You've just heard Adam. You've just heard what the diverse opinion of the people of Perth, for instance, actually think. And we have a good idea that that's probably the general sentiments around the nation and the world. So it's quite fractured. But let's start. We've talked a little bit about the ways forward. We've talked about definition, the form and content and the crafting of wars. And it's actually quite disheartening. But are there positives? We tried to talk a little bit about protective factors and strengthening a man. What are the real positives? What are the most powerful ways forward when you've got a nation like the United States which isn't obeying international instruments and is actually acting extrajudicially, allegedly?
I'm fortunate enough to work with a lot of people who are doing a lot of good work in areas where actively combating violent extremism in countries like Pakistan, Kenya, Nigeria, Jordan, and throughout the Middle East, and in fact throughout the world. And for me, the positives are that we have a lot of people who are committed to peace.
One question I'll ask there. You've travelled the world extensively, and you travel it also in your specific work to terrorism, counter-terrorism, and ways forward. So you've been to all these nations. Are you actually then seeing outcomes that would demonstrate that we actually do have great hope?
I have seen a lot of outcomes. You know, I think what I'm seeing though is that we seem to be like a lot of bees swarming on individual flowers. We don't have a big swarm. We don't all speak with one voice. This is not Australia's issue, or it's not Kenya's issue, and it's not Iraq's issue, and it's not Syria's issue. This is the world's issue. And we need to come together with one voice and really create this swarm. And we're seeing that happening slowly. We're seeing individual organisations, groups, even people, even just individuals making a difference around the world. But these are disjointed. We need to come together, and I see a positive future in this.
Alex, what's your view on that? And also take into context what we're actually seeing with the Syrian crisis, the migration of people. Many argue illegally, but someone like myself, yourself, may actually argue legally in seeking asylum. What's actually happening in Europe? With that context and that background, what...
Well, look, one of the things I alluded to in the earlier segment was that most people do fundamentally have love and compassion in their heart. And most people are pretty simple, I think. They want housing, they want employment, they want food in the belly of their children. They want a safe and comfortable and prosperous life. And Syrians are no different to Australians in that respect. And I think that I mentioned this on the first episode of your show, in which I was also a guest, that there are all kinds of interconnected social phenomena taking place around the world. The Arab Spring, the American Spring, the Occupy movement, movements across the world that are fighting essentially for the same thing, for democracy, for justice, for human rights.
The Occupy movement was actually crushed in the United States. 8,000 people were arrested, 700 on the Brooklyn Bridge, 8,000 in the 1 year. The Obama administration has prosecuted more whistleblowers than any other administration in US history. And some say part of the Arab Spring was actually orchestrated and supported by...
Well, look, the imperial powers remain. Obama continued the drone strikes in Pakistan and Somalia and Afghanistan. That imperial military agenda remains. The United States and its allied powers remain very powerful, of course, but people power, I mean, the New York Times at the time of the Iraq War famously said that there are two superpowers in the world. There's the United States and there's people power. Now, that was 12 years ago when we saw those huge demonstrations against the Iraq War, but the legacy remains, and I think people are waking up, and we saw some of those vox pops that people are politically educating themselves. They understand there's a hidden agenda here behind the wars in Syria and Iraq, and that ordinary people don't, as Anne said earlier, ordinary people don't resort to terrorism just for the heck of it. People are forced to those circumstances by horrible historical factors and economic factors that actually drive them to those sorts of horrific acts.
That they personalise. So even if they're in a Western country, and people always say to me, what makes a young, Western boy from Western Sydney go overseas to fight? Because they're personalising these global issues. You cannot extract the personal.
Who's personalising them?
The young people who are the 130 or so Australians who are over there fighting. You cannot extract the personal from the environmental, from the global.
Isn't that the most minuscule figure? 130. Isn't that the most minuscule figure?
Not really. When you consider that we have as many as the US has, so it's pretty appalling.
Well, I think we have to consider the alienating environment in which they are being politicised. Nobody's listening to young Muslim men and women. Nobody cares. We talk about our society being a democracy, but where is the platform, the democratic, non-violent platform for young men and women who, from a Muslim faith, who have legitimate grievances happening about what's happening in their homeland? They don't have the opportunity or the voice to actually, air those grievances.
Australia's got this dominant premise that their ethnicity shouldn't count and they should depart from a view to their place of origin, homeland. What's your view on that?
Well, this is something that I was kind of raised with. It was, kind of go back to your country. And it's really just displacing our responsibility onto somebody else. Coming back to this issue, it's not just the environment, it's the ineffectiveness of the counter-terrorism and countering violent extremism strategies that we've had so far. The laws to strip citizenship. What's the end game here? If your end game is to defeat Daesh or Islamic State, then don't give them people on a platter who have got who don't have citizenship to Australia and have no ties to Australia, because the first thing they do when they go there, guess what, is rip up their passports and denounce their citizenship.
Let me ask you for a comment on Syria, both of you, one after the other. Syria, you've got the Alawites, 11-12% of the population. Who are the bad guys in this? The Alawites or ISIS, or is it other groups? Or
Well, I actually, ironically enough, think that one of the very few things that Tony Abbott has said that was quite decent was when, about 18 months ago, I think it was perhaps during the election campaign, he said that the Syrian war is a case of baddies versus baddies. Now, he was lampooned for that comment.
But there's no freedom fighters fighting terrorists in this war, is there?
I don't think so. I mean, he was lampooned for that comment, but frankly, I think there was a lot of truth to it. We have Islamic State on the one hand. I mean, there's a lot of myth-making about the so-called moderate rebels. I think, unfortunately, there was a democratic uprising there that was crushed. The opposition that was there has been sidelined by Islamic State. And on the other hand, you had
the Alawites
dictatorship.
of the Assad government. Okay, now they're being portrayed as terrorists. They're 12% of the population. Many argue that they kept Syria stable, that there are political players and influences, geopolitics, that have been tapped into and fueled, for instance, like the Balkan Wars, what happened to Yugoslavia and its fracture. Are the Alawites actually trying to do the right thing and keep the country together, or are they, or should they call it a day?
I think the issue and the conflict is so complex. This is not a case of goodies versus baddies or one side versus another side. There are so many different factions all vying for power, not just within Syria, but this involves the whole redrawing of the lines of power and the traditional seats of power within the Middle East. The idea of baddie versus goodie is oversimplified, but it also, to me, speaks volumes about the futility of labelling people as terrorists or individual organisations as terrorists, the word has no meaning anymore. All it is a politicised label in order to say, look, over there, there's a terrorist, and to take away
human rights
any
and
validity.
social justice unfolds. Human rights and social justice can't be delivered by impost. Wherever that's actually happened, we've had a narrative of human suffering and misery. What's actually happened in Syria? What's actually happened in the Middle East? Has that not been crafted?
Well, it has. I'm going to look at just to add a couple of quick important points to what Anne was saying is that one, yes, there are baddies really on all sides, but we can't lose sight of the fact who are the main victims. It's the ordinary people of Syria.
That's right.
The vast majority of people of Syria, as I said earlier, they just want to get on with their lives. They want decency, democracy, human rights, and that's the great tragedy of the Syrian civil war, is that the ordinary people of Syria are suffering and that country is being destroyed. The second point to make is that it's sheer lunacy to think that Abbott's bombing of Syria will actually improve the situation. It's clearly only going to exacerbate an already terrible situation.
On that note, Alex, on that note, Anne, I'd like to thank you very much for coming on the program.
It's been a pleasure.
And on that note, the ordinary people are the ones who are suffering.
Absolutely. Thanks, Gerry.
We've heard today from a number of guests, eminent and experts in their field. It's a huge topic, terrorism, the portrayal of terrorism, and what many argue the mass propaganda that's aligned with it. We'll be back next week, live, and our topic will actually be mass propaganda.